All right, let's get started. So welcome everyone. My name is Greta Zaro with World Beyond War. I'm excited to be joining you today for our Valentine's Day webinar with Grannies for Peace. A few tech logistics. We are recording today's webinar and we will send out the recording afterwards. We will be using the chat and the raise hand feature for the Q&A at the end. And we also have closed captioning on today. If you need closed captioning, there's a CC button at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that to enable it. You can also click on that to disable it if you don't want to see it. It is automatically done by robots, so please excuse any typos. And with that, I will turn it over to Mabel from Grannies for Peace.
Well, welcome. Grannies for Peace invites you to join us on this Valentine's Day, a holiday that celebrates love. We're going to begin with inspirational music composed by Terry Rogan to a Pablo Neruda poem, The Mountain and the River. Terry is a longtime peace activist in the Capital District. She's a folk singer and a jazz musician. Terry, take it away.
Thank you, Mabel. In my country, there is a mountain. In my country, there is a river. Come with me. Come with me. Night climbs up to the mountain. Hunger goes down to the river. Come with me. Come with me. Who are those who suffer? I do not know, but they call to me. Come with me. Come with me. I do not know, but they are mine. And they say to me, we suffer. Come with me. Come with me. And they say to me, your people, your luckless people, between the mountain and the river with their hunger and grief. They do not want to struggle alone. They are waiting for you, friend. Oh, you, the one I love, little one, red grain of wheat. The struggle will be hard. Life will be hard. But will you come with me? Come with me. In my country, there is a mountain. In my country, there is a river.
Thank you, Terry. For the past 16 years, Grannies for Peace has dedicated Valentine's Day to love, a love that transcends our individual lives and encompasses a love of humanity. We have focused on issues of human suffering, such as an end to civilian deaths, an end to endless war, an end to the Afghan war, an end to racism, and in support of veterans. This year, with our co-sponsor, World Beyond War, we focus on the dire crisis in Afghanistan, and we dedicate our love to the grandmothers, mothers, children, and families of Afghanistan. I wanted to thank Greta very much for arranging this webinar. She held our grannies' hands through this process with her technical skills and her outreach. Thank you, Greta. In addition to this webinar, Grannies for Peace have carried banners, United States Sanctions Starved Afghans. If you look behind me, there is a banner hanging in my room. We took that to several peace vigils in the area. We took it to Schenectady's Peace Vigil on Friday, to Chatham on Saturday, and earlier today it was at Del Mar Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace Vigil. I wanted to point out that Peace Action has made this Valentine's Day a national day of action, trying to bring attention to the suffering in Afghanistan. And there are many peace vigils and peace demonstrations occurring throughout the country today. In 20 years of war, the longest war we've ever been in, our government spent $2.3 trillion or $300 million a day in the war effort. And yet, while we were there for 20 years, the majority of Afghans suffered from poverty, malnutrition, poor sanitation, lack of health care, environmental degradation due to the war, and a high toll of civilian casualties. Imagine what that money could have done if you had focused on human needs rather than war. The United States withdrew its troops and billions in foreign aid, and then imposed sanctions upon the Taliban government. As a result, Afghanistan is isolated in the global financial system. Banks are paralyzed. There's widespread unemployment, and there's no mechanism to pay for doctors, teachers, or civic employees. 23 million people in Afghanistan are suffering from extreme malnutrition, and millions are facing starvation during a very harsh winter when families are choosing between fuel and food, and sometimes with little money for either. 1 million children are at the brink of starvation. The Secretary General from the United Nations has asked that all nations suspend the sanctions that restrict humanitarian aid. And he has pointed out that the very economy of Afghanistan is hanging by a thread. So the sanctions have to be lifted. The recent President Biden's proposal to release $3.5 billion to a trust fund for humanitarian aid would do nothing to deal with the immediate crisis. And it would do nothing to address the economy on the verge of collapse. So on this Valentine's Day, with children starving, Grannies for Peace ask, where is the heart of the United States government? Where is the heart of the American people? We will hear from two speakers who are internationally recognized with expertise on Afghanistan. Each will speak for 20 minutes. They will provide up-to-date information on the situation in Afghanistan and give us some ideas for action. We want this to be an interactive program, so we are going to encourage the people that are here to ask questions. I'm going to review 3 ways that you can ask questions, and that will also be repeated when the speakers have finished. You can type a question in the chat box and we'll read it off. You can check the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and click raise hand, and we will call on you and unmute you. If you're dialing in by telephone, if you press *9 to raise your virtual hand, we will call on you. Now I'm going to turn to our first speaker, Kathy Kelly. Kathy Kelly is a longtime peace activist speaker who approaches humanity with compassion and her heart open, turning love into action. She's been nominated 4 times for a Nobel Peace Prize, and she has won many, many awards, but you would never hear it from Kathy's lips because she is a very humble peace activist. She has made over 24 trips to Afghanistan from 2010 2019, living in a home with young Afghan peace volunteers in a working class neighborhood in Kabul. She learned about the conditions of the Afghan war through encounters with Afghan people, mothers, widows, children, and youth. Kathy has been an educator for most of her life, and she believes that children of war and those who are victims of violence have been her most important teachers. Where you stand determines what you see. Kathy is now campaigning for an international treaty to ban weaponized drones, and she's currently on the wonderful organization World Beyond War. Kathy.
Well, thank you, Mabel, and thank you to all of your colleagues, and certainly to Greta and World Beyond War for gathering us together tonight. It's a privilege to again hear from Phyllis later in our time together, and I'm certainly very pleased to see many familiar faces, and also to know that we're a gathering that can spread the word further, which is so needed with regard to the suffering that's continually being inflicted on innocent people who mean us no harm, people in Afghanistan. Somebody who was very active in being a mentor for people, and I guess my generation of peacemakers, was Jim Forrest, and he died recently, but the last time I had an encounter with him, he said, you know, be sure to pay attention to art and what art can teach us about our time now. So I'd like to begin by trying to follow up on Jim's advice. I'm going to share my screen and just show you an image of a painting that goes all to the 16th century. It was done by Peter Bruegel, and it's a very violent painting, really. Can you see my screen? Oh, okay. And you see that clump of soldiers on horseback, and in those days, those would be the military people who had the upper hand. They're on horseback. Who can outrun them? They've got weapons, and they're attacking a village. They're killing children. It's called the Massacre of the Innocents. But the Emperor Rudolph II, years later, maybe 1604, acquired this painting. And he didn't really like the idea of making the military look like murderers, like they slaughtered children. So he had his painters cover over the picture, the images of children with parcels and bundles and pictures of birds and food, so that it looked more like this was a group of soldiers entering a village for plunder, but not to slaughter the children. Well, it might seem to us a bit clumsy for the Emperor Rudolph to have thought, well, I can just paint this over. But I ask us to recognize how the militarists and the United States Department of Defense has again and again and again covered over, eclipsed, not acknowledged child sacrifice. When I was in Afghanistan in wintertime, you know, Martha Hennessy is on this call, and I know that Martha would recall with me lingering over breakfast, but we wore every stitch of clothing that we had, and then we put blankets over ourselves. There's no central heating. There's, you know, no tap water that's clean. There's no way that people can have easy access to food and water in the places in a working class neighborhood in Afghanistan. But I so clearly remember our young friends asking, well, why did so many Western people go over to Iraq? And, you know, they were so young, they didn't know much about Iraq's history. And so we started to tell them that hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children had died because of the economic sanctions against Iraq. And we started to tell them how those children became more vulnerable to other diseases because they were starving. And I remember the looks on those youngsters' faces and their question, why would anybody in your country ever want to punish children who couldn't control a dictator? And now, my friends, some of those same young people are themselves young Afghan parents of babies, of infants, and they're sending panicked messages. The price of bread has gone so high, we can't afford it. Our neighbors are coming to tell us that their children are dying of cold and they can't afford fuel. And so the question that becomes so readily apparent to us must be made more apparent to the US public. Are we going to ban child sacrifice? Will we continue to sacrifice children? As Mabel said, 1 million Afghan children might not survive this winter. And so we face the terrible, terrible scandal of Afghan resources being seized as though the United States has an automatic right to take the income of Afghan people. Well, I think it is very, very important always in these circumstances, as Mabel had said, you know, we had this mantra, you know, where you stand determines what you see. Well, to try to keep seeing the faces of real people. And one artwork which really has haunted me over the years comes from neighboring Pakistan. It was put together by people who wanted others to recognize that children were becoming orphaned when drone strikes would be waged against families. And this is a little girl who lost both of her parents, this innocent little girl. And the way that the artist created her face on the ground constituted something that could be seen from up above by a drone. If a drone were flying over, they would see the face of this little girl. And I think it's so important for us not to turn away from the faces of the human beings who've been so affected by our war. And one of the stories that I think is especially important to continue to grip us, to haunt us, is the story of the family of Zamarai Ahmadi. And, you know, in all my visits to Afghanistan, I think I met one person who actually owned a car in this working class area where we always stayed. Well, Zemarai Ahmadi worked for a United States NGO, and he had the company car. And it was such an excitement to the neighborhood. People were always asking him to do errands. But when he would pull in this white Toyota Corolla, the kids in his household, he was the only breadwinner for an extended family. So there were nieces and nephews and his own children. They'd all come outside and he would let one of the boys park the car. So it was kind of a big deal. He thought this is the last day that he would spend in Kabul because he thought he had his bags packed, and so did his wife, that he and his wife and his children were going to go to the United States. He worked for the company called Nutrition and Education International. He'd been with them for 6 years. He had a visa to go to the United States. So he was doing all kinds of errands in his car, and one of them was to pick up water in a time of drought. Clean water has to be sometimes brought into houses in canisters. And so he was gingerly placing canisters of water in the back of his car. He had been tracked for 8 hours by drone analysts and drone operators whose camera kept on picking up images which led them to believe he was a terrorist, that he had stopped at an Islamic State in the Khorasan province safe house, that he had put weapons, explosives in the back of his car, that he was driving a white Toyota Corolla, and that's what some of these terrorists drive. Well, you can see hundreds of those on the streets of Kabul. And so as he pulled into the driveway, and as the excited kids were coming out, the order was given, impact, and a Predator drone fired a Hellfire missile that fell, exploded on top of that car. And so I ask us to spend a little time with this kind of mantra, don't look away. These are the 3 children that were killed, that were toddlers. Hayat, age 2, Sumaya and Maleka, age 3. These are 2 of the young boys, ages 6 and 7, Benjamin and Arvin. And this is the youngest son of Zemarai Ahmadi, age 14. This next eldest son, age 16. And his oldest son, age 20. And this is Zemarai Ahmadi. This happened on August 29th. By mid-October, the family members who had survived had not heard one word from the United States government, from the Department of Defense, from the Secretary of State. The matter still hasn't been resolved. The family members surviving are still in Afghanistan, although they have pled to be evacuated because they've been so associated with Westerners, and that can be a danger in Afghanistan now. But I think it's so incumbent on us to see the faces and not to look away. And I see that as sort of a window to a wider issue, because as the United States withdrew its troops from Afghanistan, and some people have said it's almost like they turned off the generator, threw away the key, and then left Afghanistan. As this has happened, there hasn't been any effort to ask, well, what have been the consequences, and what can we learn from this war? And no sense of how can we tell the truth about this war so we might not move into such another disastrous war. Rather, the United States military has wasted no time trying to again use the fear card and scare the United States public into thinking, oh, we must get ready for another war, perhaps a war with China. I know Ukraine is also very, very much on our minds, but they are constantly pushing to get a new generation of weapons like the drone, weapons, but ones that would be just a software upgrade away from becoming completely autonomous weaponry. And in the war games that the United States has done with China, the United States keeps on losing. And so the military has actually stated now that in the event of a military engagement with China, recourse to nuclear weapons would become not a possibility, but a probability. That we would be pushing and pushing toward crossing the threshold into a nuclear war. And so I go back to that question about sacrificing children. And it would not only be Iraqi children, Afghanistan's children, but children all throughout the world. And also on this call is my friend Kathy Breen. And Kathy was with me during the shock and awe bombing in Iraq, when we so often would go to the hospitals and sit at the bedsides of children whose bodies had been torn apart. And it's almost as though there's this interchange for which there is no remorse between military warfare campaigns and economic warfare. And it seems to me that the people who are guaranteed to suffer the most are the most vulnerable, the people least able to control their governments. And so as my young friends in Afghanistan once asked me, well, what about the adults in the United States? Can't you control your government? And it does get increasingly difficult, I must acknowledge, because of the financial shenanigans, if you will, of the major military contractors, and of course, politicians who are in some ways flunkies of these major military contractors and major money movers. But then we have President Biden, who to me inscrutably has decided to take steps that will make it almost impossible to free up the desperately needed humanitarian aid for Afghanistan, and almost impossible to restart Afghanistan's economy. And I mean, I think certainly humanitarian aid is important, but let's not kid ourselves. When it says in the executive order that this release of humanitarian aid will be contingent on solving the court cases for the 9/11 families, some of those cases haven't even started through the court system. So if no humanitarian aid can be parceled out under the supervision of the United States, which has already shown itself to be completely inadequate, having turned Afghanistan's civil services and health services and education services into a shambles because it wasn't able to overcome the corruption, the extreme corruption that accompanied the input of past influx of US aid to Afghanistan. It's saying that this has to be parceled out according to a United States timetable that's dependent on the court cases being resolved makes me very skeptical that the humanitarian aid would reach people, certainly not during this very dire winter. But also, you can't use doling out humanitarian aid as a way to rescue the economy, which is on the verge of collapse. If people aren't paid, and the salaries of the healthcare workers, the teachers, the civil servants were being paid out of the Afghan central bank. If people aren't being paid, they can't buy food, they can't buy goods. If the farmers can't sell their crops, then they're not going to cultivate their land. And so you can see the many, many problems conspiring to make it extremely difficult for people to feed their families. I want to ask you to allow me to share my screen again. And, you know, the United States, I believe, never was able to understand patterns of life in Afghanistan, even though ostensibly they had dedicated so many blimp surveillance vehicles to pour over Kabul and, you know, follow and track people. In spite of all of the drone surveillance, they couldn't understand patterns of life in anything close to what my young Afghan friends understood. Martha would recall going up a mountainside in Afghanistan to visit widows and children who lived near the top of the mountain and were farther away from water. And so their rents were somewhat lower. But in order to try to understand what's happening to these women living in hovels and with just nothing close to what they needed for survival, they would carry notebooks and pens and ask survey questions. And their surveys asked the widows, how often in a week do you eat beans? And what is your source of water? How far do you walk to fetch it? What's your rent? How do you pay the rent? Who brings an income into the family? And when the answer to that question was a child under age 12, then that survey went to the top of the deck. And then our young friends went back down the mountain and they looked over their surveys. They sat on the floor, they put them in order of who was the neediest, and they tried to represent Hazara and Tajik and Pashto groups so there would be overcoming of ethnic differences. And they developed a project where they enabled the women to get this kind of kryptonite green colored fleece, synthetic fleece, and coverlet materials. And they manufactured over the years thousands of heavy, life-saving blankets. And those blankets would be loaded up on rickety old lorries. I would always have my heart in my throat. Don't let that truck tip over this time, because somebody was perched on top. And then they would take those to refugee camps and distribute them free of charge. Now, this was the kind of thing that actually represented sharing and service and caring. And this could be emblematic of what the United States could be known for if, in fact, our leaders ever embraced the idea of global solidarity and collaboration and extending a hand of friendship and not insisting again and again and again that obsolete and dangerous methods of warfare must dominate our foreign policy. So thank you very much for this time in this webinar, and I look forward to questions and also certainly to hearing from Phyllis. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you very much. I'm always overwhelmed when I hear you speak. Phyllis, we are very, very fortunate to have Phyllis. She is an international writer, speaker, columnist, author who has expertise in Afghanistan. She is a fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and of the Amsterdam-based transnational institutes. She writes and speaks widely across the US and throughout the world on Middle East issues, including Afghanistan, Palestine, Syria, Iran, and US foreign policy. She's a co-founder of the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, yay, and an Iraq-era anti-war coalition, United for Peace and Justice, and serves on the board of Jewish Voices for Peace and the board of the Afro-Middle East Center in Johannesburg. Her books include Ending the US War on Afghanistan and US Foreign Policy and the War on Terror. It is with pleasure that I turn it over to Phyllis Bennis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mabel, and thanks to all the Grannies for Peace, the organizers for tonight, World Without War. Kathy, it's great to see you and I always learn from you. And what a wonderful way to celebrate and commemorate Valentine's Day, but to recommit ourselves to ending wars and ending the destruction of populations and people and climates and countries all around the world. Let me start with something short, which is what the Biden administration has gotten right. It's a short one. That is, they ended the conventional war in in Afghanistan. Let's start that again. They have ended the conventional war in Afghanistan. That was the right decision. They did it badly. They made terrible, not just mistakes, but it was done in a horrific way. but it was still a necessary act. Ending the conventional war, however, does not mean that the war has ended for Afghans. The US has made clear that it will, when it decides it's necessary, continue to use military force from, quote, over the horizon. That means drones, that means airstrikes, that means more civilians could die. But it is very important to recognize that the conventional war against Afghanistan was ended. And it was ended because people like Grannies for Peace fought for decades, fought for 20 years to end that war. And we went as a country from a moment when 88% of the people of this country agreed that going to war in Afghanistan was the just and righteous thing to do, to the moment now when 76% of Americans say it wasn't worth it. It was never worth it. That's a huge reversal. And it didn't just happen because the war did so much damage. We might like to think that, but it's not true. It happened because we had movements in this country that fought to change people's minds. And that combined with the reality of what the wars were leaving behind, we have managed to change those minds. It would be a much sweeter victory if we could say that the drone war is also ended, that no one in the United States is going to have the authority to issue orders for more war against Afghanistan, but we can't quite say that. The US is responsible, not for all, but for most of the suffering of the people of Afghanistan for decades. The wars that the US has engaged in since the 1980s, and yes, the Soviet Union made terrible mistakes, but you know what? The Soviet Union's gone now. It's a different country, making their own mistakes for sure, but not so much in Afghanistan. But we have to look at what our government's mistakes were, the government's decisions that were enabled by our tax dollars and by the refusal of Congress to stop it, and by the fact that it took a long time for our movements to be able to change minds sufficiently. In between the beginning of the wars, the war in Afghanistan began on October 7th, 2001, just 3 weeks after the 9/11 attacks. It took years before we began the process of changing public opinion on whether this was legitimate or not. And too many people believed the propaganda that this was somehow a war of justice, when we knew from the beginning this was a war of vengeance and not of justice at all. We know none of the hijackers came from Afghanistan. They didn't live in Afghanistan. They lived in Hamburg. They didn't train in Afghanistan. They trained in Florida. They didn't go to flight school in Afghanistan. They went to flight school in Minnesota. And yet we took this position that going to war against one of the poorest countries in the world that had lived for a decade under crippling civil war, and for years from 1996 until 2001, for 5 years, had lived under this horribly repressive regime of the Taliban. We knew that this was not a war of justice. You know, remember, this was a war that was supposedly fought for the women of Afghanistan because the Taliban were so oppressive to women. Well, that part was true. They were and are incredibly oppressive to women. What we didn't hear so much about was that they were only one notch worse than the warlords disguised as a government that the US put in power in this new government, who also had no respect for women. One of them, a guy named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, when he was a 17-year-old university student, he was the one that had the creative idea that women who had the audacity to think that they maybe had the right to an education should be punished, and that the best punishment he could think of was throwing acid in the face of those young women. He was on our side. He was one of those guys that President Reagan described as the new founding fathers of the new Afghanistan. He wasn't with the Taliban. He fought against the Taliban. He's still in and around the government. He's been in the government, out of the government, but he's still an official figure in Afghanistan. And you know, when the US overthrew the government of the Taliban and invaded and went to war in Afghanistan on October 7th of 2001, The maternal and infant mortality rates in Afghanistan were the worst in the world, the very worst in the world, the worst place for a woman to give birth and think she would survive, and the worst place for a child to be born and think that she would survive to her first birthday or her fifth birthday. And that was a real issue of the repression and oppression of women in Afghanistan. And then the US occupied Afghanistan for 20 years. And 20 years later, the infant mortality rate is still the worst in the world. After 20 years of the US spending $2 billion on war and hundreds of millions of dollars, $2 trillion on the war and some billions of dollars on supposedly rebuilding the country, it is still the worst country in the world for a child to be born and survive. And the only reason that it's not still the worst in maternal mortality, that it's not still the worst place in the world for a woman to give birth and think she will survive childbirth, is that about 5 countries in sub-Saharan Africa have slipped so far down on all of the levels of what it takes to provide for women that it is slightly worse there. Otherwise, Afghanistan would remain at the bottom. So what we're seeing now, this new humanitarian crisis that emerged very suddenly in August when the US pulled out and the Taliban took over as the new government of the country, the humanitarian crisis that President Biden and the United States government is about to massively increase, to massively compound this existing crisis, which is now one of the worst in the world. It's a question day by day whether Afghanistan or Yemen are the worst crises in the world, both of which are caused by wars in which the United States has played a major role, directly in the case of Afghanistan and through providing arms and training to the Saudi government and the UAE in Yemen. We bear responsibilities for the conditions that make Afghanistan and Yemen the 2 worst crises, humanitarian crises going on in the world today. And what we're seeing now is not only the immediate level of hunger, the 23 million Afghans who are food insecure and who are hungry, the 1 million children that are in danger of dying of malnutrition in the next weeks or months. But we are also preventing, as Kathy already explained, what it would take to rebuild the economy, to begin the process of rebuilding this economy that was shredded by our years of war and sanctions. The United States is bragging right now that it has paid just over $500 million in humanitarian aid in the last few months. Compare that to the $2.5 trillion it spent on the war, you get chump change. Chump change, that's what they're sending. And it doesn't take into account that what we need is real reparations in Afghanistan, not just humanitarian aid that's in the emergency. We need that, yes. That will keep those 1 million children from dying of cold and malnutrition. But it will do nothing for what happens when the weather gets warmer and there is still no way to find money to buy seed for the farmers to plant something, where there is still not enough money because the banks have shut down, the currency is worthless. And people don't have the ability to buy the food that does exist in the markets. So what we're talking about now is that the US is being very generous. We're offering to spend half of the $7 billion that belongs to the people of Afghanistan, does not belong to the Taliban, and certainly does not belong to our government, that we are offering to give half of that to a trust fund that at some point would provide some kind of humanitarian aid to someone in Afghanistan. And the rest, the other half, we will spend here on the victims of the horrific attacks of 9/11 that led to the deaths of 3,000 people and many, many families that are clearly still in mourning. But we will take that money from the mouths of starving children in Afghanistan who had nothing to do with the crimes that were committed, the crimes against humanity that were committed on September 11th of 2001. Where is the justice in any of that? The Central Bank of Afghanistan, which ironically is still functioning as an independent agency, not being run by the Taliban, the head of the central bank said that it was created under US control with US economists, creating the method it would use to function as a stabilizing force. And its board members right now are saying it is still able to function independently, that it is not being controlled by the Taliban, and that its ownership is that of the Afghan people, not any government there. And its objectives are to implement monetary policy and to facilitate international trade and to stabilize the financial sector. All of that with the goal of rebuilding the shredded Afghan economy. That's different than the role of the urgently needed humanitarian aid that's designed to keep people alive so that they can take advantage of the moment when an economy is reborn. Members of the wonderful organization Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, the families of victims of the 9/11 attacks, who came together in the days after those attacks to say, not in our name, not in our name, should any more people be killed, because it will not bring back our loved ones who were lost. And they have said they are outraged at the idea that any of their comrade families, if you will, who have raised these lawsuits should be paid with the money that belongs to the people of Afghanistan. So President Biden is trying to have it both ways. He's trying to say that the Taliban is not a legitimate government, so we can't return Afghanistan's funds to that government, but it's legitimate enough somehow that he's willing to pay the Taliban's debt for it, saying that the Taliban owes this debt because there's a US court case that says they do. Despite the fact that no Afghans were involved, that every analyst who was on the ground and who analyzed it later agrees that the Taliban government didn't even know what Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda terrorists were planning while they were living in Afghanistan. And when we have a military budget of $778 billion this year, where 53 cents of every federal dollar goes to the military, is that enough of a reason that we can say it's okay to take this small amount of money, the $3.5 billion, chump change, relative to the US military budget, relative to what it's spent on war, that half of that, which should be not going to the military, should go to pay for jobs and healthcare and a Green New Deal, that instead that's going to go to pay off a court debt set against the Taliban? Emergency conditions mean that real humanitarian aid is needed. That's clearly the case. But that is very different from allowing the Afghans to rebuild their own economy. We have to look at not only a demand that says, do not give half of that money that belongs to the people of Afghanistan to US courts to use to pay a victim's fee, that we have to deal with the aftermath of what happens when the US imposed an artificial economy for 20 years and then suddenly cut it off. An economy that was completely propped up by outside foreign money, mainly US money, suddenly cut off. And the technocrats who are trying to run the central bank in Afghanistan are saying that it needs to come back to them so that they can do that work of rebuilding the economy. Will any of it end up in the hands of the Taliban? Yeah, probably. And that's the price you pay when you walk away from a 20-year-long occupation, when you lose a war. So what are the consequences of the US failure to pull out? The banks are closed, salaries are unpaid, inflation and unemployment are both skyrocketing across Afghanistan. We talked about the 23 million who are lacking already reliable access to food. They also lack access to electricity, to heat. So children are starving or freezing to death, but children are dying. There was an extraordinary short quote from the New York Times, one of the New York Times reporters on this issue, Max Fisher, who said, Afghans are starving not because of insufficient emergency aid, but because the US forcibly emptied the government coffers, triggering a currency crisis and shutting down government salaries and services. This move is a death sentence for untold numbers of civilians, including many kids and unborn babies. So what's our job? We need to be pushing for more US emergency aid. Yes, definitely through the UN agencies, through some of the international NGOs, but just as urgently, we need to push for releasing Afghanistan's own money back to Afghanistan so that there can be food in the shops, there can be salaries, the cash will be in the banks. Teachers and healthcare workers that both work for the government and haven't been paid their salaries since August will once again be able to be paid and can then buy food. We have to push our government to stop preventing the International Monetary Fund from denying access to Afghanistan for what they call special drawing rights, which gives them the right to get access to emergency funds. The US can unlock that, and so far they are refusing to. We have to stop the sanctions. Sanctions can no longer be able to be talked about as an alternative to war. They are not an alternative to war. Sanctions are an instrument of war, and they kill more civilians than the weapons that we are more accustomed to calling weapons. We have to stop even the sanctions on banks in the immediate, like tomorrow. The White House should issue what they call letters of reassurance to the banks, saying that it is fine for them to release letters of credit, allow trade to go back to Afghanistan. But most importantly, we have to end those sanctions. They are crippling an economy and they are killing children. Later, there will be the need to engage more officially with the Taliban. They are the government that's in control. The US, we should note, is already engaging with the Taliban. They're dealing with them around keeping the airports open, about questions of evacuations, and the human rights issues have been raised with them. I think we're going to see that the Taliban, whether or not they have changed significantly, they are dealing in a significantly changed environment that is going to force a very different form. Eventually, we don't know how long that will take, and people will suffer in the meantime. But we should not believe that by starving people, they will somehow do better in challenging the human rights violations of the Taliban. All it means is that they will die first. So that's, I think, our job. We have to look at preventing a continuation of this war, stopping the notion that somehow using drones or airstrikes from over the horizon will mean we're no longer at war with Afghanistan, that it's something else. For Afghans, that's what the war looked like. That's why we heard from women in Afghanistan after the US pullout, when US reporters were running around the country saying, well, what do you think about this? What's going to happen? What's going to happen to you women? And some of them, not all of them, somebody like Mahbouba Siraj from the Afghan Women's Network said that what she felt was an absolute sense of relief, that the bombs would no longer be falling, and that she would no longer fear that her husband and her sons were going to be killed by going outside. That's what her recollection was. They asked her later about the human rights issues. Yes, those are important, but first we have to live. That's the first human right. So I think that's what our job looks like. We have an obligation to the people of Afghanistan to provide real compensation, real reparations, not just the emergency aid. And we have a good chance of being able to do that. The polls show that people are with us. The poll in May of last year said that 62% of people in the United States approved of withdrawing all US troops. Only 29% were opposed. We're starting much better than we started in 2001. And what's going to happen with the Taliban? They're there now. They may not be there forever, but people in Afghanistan still live there. 150,000 or so Afghans were able to get out in the emergency evacuation, and 40 million Afghans still live in their country. We have an obligation to them, the obligation of reparations, of compensation. We don't have an obligation to continue the war. That's our job as a movement, and that's what I hope that we can talk about tonight. Thank you all.
Wow, thank you so much, Phyllis, and thank you, Kathy, for your incredible presentations. I think I can see from the chat that everyone is very appreciative of what you've shared tonight. And now we have ample time for Q&A and discussion, and my colleague Mark Elliott Stein will be assisting with this as well. We will be pulling questions out of the chat box, Also, you can use the raise hand feature if you click on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and then click raise hand. We'll call on you. And then if you're dialing in on your telephone, you can press *9, and that's another way to raise your virtual hand. So let's go to one question first from the chat. There was a question about electoral organizing and whether, is it time to get a new president? Should we be campaigning for candidates like Dennis Kucinich? Or do you see that as a strategy, electoral organizing, to resolve this issue? Kathy or Phyllis?
You want to go first, Kath? You're muted. I'll go first then if you're having trouble unmuting. I think that electoral organizing is very important, but I also believe that elections for president in this era are almost always elections between lesser evils. That is a very important vote to cast. Lesser evils are lesser, and people at the lowest rungs of hierarchies, economic hierarchies, social hierarchies, they are the ones who suffer the most in that last inch. So it matters whether the lesser evil or the greater evil gets elected. It matters for life and death. So we have to vote. The idea of third parties, I think, is a very important idea, but I think it also has to start at the bottom. I don't think you start by running people for president. I think you start by running people for city council. You start by running people for state attorneys general who control elections. You start by running candidates for state assemblies and all of those things. When we have solid alternative third parties in enough states, then I think we talk seriously about running third party candidates for president. But I think we start where people are. We start local.
Thank you, Phyllis. You know, the world came closer than ever before to stopping a war before it started in the run-up to the 2003 war against Iraq. Now, when you ask yourself, well, how did people know about conditions inside Iraq? Not because they were reading about it in the pages of the mainstream newspapers or hearing about it in the television presentations. Name the groups: Veterans for Peace, Peace Action, Pax Christi, Voices in the Wilderness, all manner of different faith-based groups, Christian peacemaker teams. People sent delegations over to Iraq that came back and hit the ground running and accomplished so much grassroots organizing and education that millions of people turned out to try and stop that war. Now, believe me, it's one of the greatest disappointments of my adult life that the sanctions weren't lifted against Iraq, that war wasn't prevented. But I think that when Phyllis says start at the bottom, it is exactly with the kind of coalition and organizing that we're seeing represented in tonight's webinar. Thank you again to all of the organizers. But you know, it was so impressive to me that all across the United States today, people in cities were going out at the urging and the behest of Peace Action, Code Pink, Grannies for Peace, other various kinds of groupings. So let's keep that up. I think it's very, very important to keep Afghanistan in the news. And to some extent, you know, Asma Khan with the New York Times did a remarkable job in putting Afghanistan in the news and telling the truth about just 5 years of United States killing of civilians in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. And so I think we need to say to the Congress, look, you don't have to be suing the Pentagon or, you know, clamoring for Freedom of Information Acts to get the information. You tell the Department of Defense you want to know the full story of who was killed through United States attacks on civilians. I think also this might sound unrelated, but stand by Daniel Everett Hale. Daniel Hale is in prison now, and 4 years in the Marion Penitentiary. And he said in the sentencing statement, Your Honor, I stole papers. Yeah, he gave those papers to Jeremy Scahill. And he said he did that because he could no longer take what was not his to take, the lives of innocent people. So I think keep on holding up the mirror to say, this is who we are in this country. And this is why all around the world. There will be groups, and there are groups who are so fed up with the United States that in fact, we endanger security for future generations. And then I think we also have to keep on emphasizing that the greatest terrors we face are the terrors of what we're doing to our own environment, keep building coalition with the climate activists who sense the catastrophe we face, and the terrors of pandemic, and keep emphasizing the need to engage in solidarity globally in trying to make friends with other countries like China, for instance, so that we can solve these very real problems that we face. And so in some ways, Afghans can, as they have been for such a long time in my own personal life, can be our teachers.
Thank you, Kathy and Phyllis. Let's go to Lisa, who has a hand raised. Lisa, you can now unmute.
Okay, thank you so much. I have 2 quick questions and then a third comment. It's very heartbreaking for me to see those children. And when you showed the picture of the little girl that had been orphaned, I know millions were orphaned in Iraq, but who is caring?
Oh, Lisa, you're muted.
Let's see, we'll get you back in a second. Here you go. You should be able to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. I wanted to know who is caring for the orphans in Afghanistan right now.
I'm aware of one very, very wonderful orphanage called Mahbuba's Promise in Kabul. But quite honestly, the family networks are such that very often if a child's parents are gone, the families will somehow work it out so that a young person will be cared for within the family networks. And yet there are also some families that are just so poor they can't feed their children, and so they will bring the children to an orphanage. But Lisa, there are so many young ones that are working as child laborers to support families. It's one of the most difficult places in the world in which to be a child.
That's heartbreaking. You mentioned that people cannot afford food in any of the markets. Is that food going to waste? Can't they create little communities where people agree to feed each other? If they cannot afford the food would just go to waste. It would seem to me to organize some kind of little communities to donate the food to so everyone can eat.
Well, I will say that I was privy to a small group of youngsters whose idealism was such that they were constantly trying to figure out ways to share resources and to support ecological developments that would be more wise for Afghanistan. They planted thousands of trees, and they made sure that food rations were given to the street kids. And so I have seen that. But I also realize that in an agricultural economy, which is what Afghanistan is, the people who survive because they plant the food and they cultivate the crops, they plant the crops and they cultivate and harvest those crops, they have to be able to sell them. And so that's why we were so alarmed to see the Afghan economy on the verge of collapse. At some point, there has to be a maintenance of mechanisms for buying and selling. And so I hope that people will share resources. I imagine that they will, but there certainly is not a plentiful supply right now.
Okay. My third comment, as an American citizen, I find it extremely frustrating because I remember when Eisenhower in '61 warned about the military industry complex. And it seems to me that the president has extremely limited power, that he's merely a puppet for the military industry complex because war makes money, and you've got companies like Lockheed Martin and all these other companies who profit from war. And you've got the CIA, and they seem to be running the show more than the president. So how do we as Americans, I mean, what kind of power do we have to change that?
We have enormous power. The democracy, in my view, in this country is a very injured one. It's not a good democracy. It's not a healthy democracy. But there is a democratic structure that can be reclaimed. Presidents are not puppets. They can make decisions. They can choose to go along with the economic interests of the major corporations. You know, Eisenhower's speech originally identified the military-industrial congressional complex. He blamed Congress as much as anything else. And we hear it now. We heard just a few days ago from the CEO of Boeing that in a report to shareholders that, you know, there were some concerns with the end of the war in Afghanistan, but there's problems in Eastern Europe. And we think, I don't remember his exact words, but the essence of it was, we think we'll be hearing some good news from that part of the world pretty soon. So they are looking at that. There is no question that war is a profitable business in the United States and some other countries. And that's a huge component of what we need to be doing. One of the resources that I would urge people to take a look at, my colleagues at IPS that run the National Priorities Project has a trade-offs section on their website, nationalpriorities.org. And I forget exactly where it is, but you find the trade-offs and it will tell you for any city, any county, any state in the United States or the country as a whole, how much money is being spent this year or for the last 20 years on the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, all the wars, the whole military budget, whatever one you want, for whatever city or state you want. And it will give you a choice of about 15 or 20 alternatives where that same amount of money, how many children could get health care, how many Head Start slots could be made available, how many houses could be retrofitted with green energy, how many veterans could get health care. There's a whole range of things.
Right.
And when you go to a city and you present that to people, it's an astonishing thing to see how people react to that and say, wait, you're saying we're paying all that for wars that don't make us safer and that are killing children, and it could be used to do something right for our town and our children? So it's a very useful thing to think about. It's not enough for us to say, well, our democracy doesn't work, so we throw up our hands and say, you know, presidents are just a puppet and there's nothing we can do about it. We have to change and reclaim those democratic processes. We can't allow fascists that are moving in our political echelons
Right.
to destroy it.
I agree. Where can I start?
Start with nationalprioritiesproject.org. Go there and you'll get some information about your own city and start talking to people. That's how you
Okay.
start.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Lisa, for your question. We have a lot of other questions to get to, and I see several hands raised. We will try to make time for everything as much as possible. I want to go to an interesting question from the chat, which says, would you use the word genocide to refer to the situation in Afghanistan or Yemen? And if yes, like what are the implications of using that term? And I think this is very interesting because I've seen other activists also using this term, and I've seen a few quotes from officials potentially suggesting that. So I'm curious about this one as well.
Oh, Phyllis, please go ahead.
Well, I don't know if we have the same position on this, Kathy. We may or we may not. I think it depends. For me, I don't use the term genocide because in international law, genocide has a very specific definition that involves specific intent. It's like the difference between first-degree murder and second-degree murder. You know, on the one hand, the person is just as dead, so why does it matter? But if we're serious about international law being representative of serious law and different kinds of accountability, I think we have to take that seriously. To be an act of genocide requires a deliberate attempt to destroy a national grouping. It can be by killing, but it doesn't have to be by killing. It can be by creating situations that destroy the group identity. It can be forced transfer. So the use technically of the term genocide for what Israel is doing to the Palestinians is actually accurate in my view. I don't think it's useful because most people think that the word genocide only means killing deliberately, and it doesn't. It means a number of things, but the deliberate part of it is what's key. We had this argument for years and years, Kathy will remember, around the Iraq sanctions issues about whether to call it genocide. Some of us, like me, waffled, and we took the position that the impact was genocidal on the population. But I was not prepared to say that the sanctions were in fact an act of genocide because they were designed for a political goal which was not specifically to kill the people of Iraq. The impact was genocidal because it was killing an entire society. But I don't think the word was accurate because it wasn't the goal. It wasn't the intention. It has to be it's like a specific intent crime. Some crimes are specific intent crimes, some are not. Genocide is the same thing.
Actually, Phyllis, I am in agreement with you there, and I could certainly understand that perspective with regard to Iraq as well. It seems to me that the United States has said, I mean, I can remember when I was in college, I heard Noam Chomsky speak, and I was pretty electrified. And I remember him saying that the United States has said to other countries all around the world, if you do not subordinate yourselves to fulfill our national interest, we can eliminate your children. Now, that to me speaks of war crimes, and I've seen them played out in my adult life, whether we're looking at Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan or Yemen. We do need international criminal courts. So I think we have to let the lawyerly language of the courts persist and be respectful of it. But we also, I think, have got to recognize the war crimes that have been committed in our name. I've just been seeing in the chat some people saying, well, you know, what about taxpayers? And, you know, why are we letting our income be directed toward this kind of criminality? And so, you know, I think we have to be willing to take on the very stark language that, you know, we've said to other people that if they don't accomplish the regime change, which we think is in, you know, the benefit of the United States interests, we will exert collective punishment on their populations. And so it's important to not dodge that pattern.
I would just add one point to that. I absolutely agree with that. There is a period in the history of the United States, and I'm speaking here of the long-standing wars against the indigenous people of what is now the United States, that were deliberately aimed at eliminating those populations. That was genocide. That was genocide. That's what the great Howard Zinn taught us, was that we have to understand that the roots of our country are in genocide and slavery, and that we simultaneously have to recognize that our country has always been characterized by movements against genocide and slavery, and that both of those realities are important components of our national history.
Thank you. A quick question is, in terms of the funds and releasing that $7 billion, is it technically Congress? Is it technically Biden? Who has the authority on that? And while Phyllis and Kathy are answering that, I'm going to put a petition in the chat that World Beyond War is part of, along with a number of other groups, which goes to both Biden and Congress. But I'd love to hear your answer, Kathy and Phyllis.
Well, Biden issued an executive order which further froze that money and kind of organized exactly how it was going to remain frozen. I think his executive order could have been worded entirely differently. So I would say that President Biden bears a very great responsibility this time. That doesn't lessen the responsibility of Congress for oversight, and the courts are certainly going to be involved over time, but I would lay this one at President Biden's door.
I think that's absolutely right. I do think it's the kind of thing that letters to Congress should certainly, anybody meeting with their members of Congress, all of that, it should certainly be on the agenda, because Congress could intervene. Congress could, because there is money involved in something like creating a trust fund, that cost a certain amount of money. It's a pittance, it's not much. But if there's any money being spent, Congress can say, no, we have the right of, we control the purse. So, but yes, it is Biden who's ultimately responsible for this one at this point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go to Bob, who has a hand raised. Bob, you can now unmute.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much, Kathy and Phyllis, for presenting tonight, and everyone that participated or is participating. I don't know if you guys remember Raffle DeFeer, who was put in jail, federal penitentiary for 17 years, for setting up a charity to help Iraq. And I had a little argument with Mr. Bolton in Union College. He went to speak to my alma mater, and I debated him in front of 1,000 people about the sanctions, because he was talking about, remember, he'd say, Iraq has to be bombed immediately, right now, he wanted to bomb. And even Trump, as weird as he was, he got rid of him. He said all he wants to do is start wars all the time. So he's sitting right there in front of me, debating with me, and I said, sanctions. I said, you want to do this with sanctions? What about the sanctions on Iraq? Killed 500,000 kids under the age of 5 and 1 million over the age of 5. Now you got sanctions on Afghanistan. Do you want to invade Iran? It just went down. I try to be quickly about it, but it just went downhill. But my question is this. A few nights ago, there was a gentleman on a Zoom from the Central Bank of Afghanistan. I don't know how many people saw that Zoom. And he talked about some of the things you brought up, Phyllis, about how the central bank was set up, and the duties, responsibilities to the central bank, and how humanitarian aid was not the answer, because that was not going to be spent. That could even be taken out of the country. It could go anyway. It could go all these different directions. That had nothing to do. Like you say, these are two different streams of aid. That was one of his points. And it was so frustrating. He was so well spoken, and he made all these points. And he made them so calmly. It just brought tears to your eyes how he could make them so calmly in the face of all this tragedy every 2 minutes over there. So did you see that presentation? Do you know the man I'm talking about?
I've seen some quotes from two different people that are both on the board of the Afghan Central Bank. I don't know who it was who you saw, but I think the point is right. The point is that there's a separate need for both emergency humanitarian aid, which goes through the United Nations agencies and some other international NGOs, and there's a need to allow the Afghans through their central bank to rebuild their economy so that people can have jobs and be able to buy seeds to farm and all those things. So both are needed and they're different.
Don't you remember in Iraq, remember the forklifts of money we were putting in Iraq? The forklifts of money that we were giving them. Now there's no money. Whoop, there's no money. But this money to move the troops to the borders of Ukraine, no one knows how much money it costs to move troops to the border. You know what I'm saying? I'll stop and let somebody else talk.
Bob, I just want to mention that it's impressive to me that the president of the International Commission of the Red Cross, one of the main humanitarian agencies, didn't hesitate to excoriate the United States for imposing these economic measures. He told Agence France Presse that these sanctions meant to punish those in power in Kabul are instead freezing millions of people across Afghanistan out of the basics they need to survive. And he told the international media, I am livid. So that's a good thing if we can get some of the people that Antonio Guterres, as Phyllis mentioned, also Secretary General of the United Nations, insisting that the countries of the world have got to lift these sanctions. So our job is to keep that momentum going.
Thank
And I
you. Thank you, Bob, for your question. I'm going to go to another question from the chat. This is from Colin, who's on World Beyond War's board. And Colin asks, the occupation of Afghanistan was done with a quote unquote cooperation of other NATO nations. What part should the other NATO members who were engaged in the war play in demanding reparations?
Well, certainly the European Union could speak up and say that they don't want to cooperate with these sanctions. We haven't heard that yet. I think that we have to hope that there will be international solidarity amongst people from France, from Germany, from the UK, and I noticed Anne Wright, she had to leave, but she writes, keep calling the White House, writing op-eds, emailing your congresspersons, and I would add to that, being in touch with people in networks all around the world so that we can push for an end to the suffering in Afghanistan that's been facilitated by so many invading and warlord governments.
Absolutely. And I would just add to that, that we should be hoping that and helping our friends in these other countries, the other NATO countries in particular, to be very clear with their governments that this is about what their governments are doing diplomatically around these sanctions. NATO is a military alliance, and it's not up to NATO. NATO should be gotten out of the way. We shouldn't be asking NATO to be responsible for reparations or compensation or anything. This is the bull in the china shop. When the bull breaks everything in the china shop, you don't ask the bull to stay there. You get the bull the hell out of the china shop and write a check for the damage from somebody else. That's what we need to be serious about. This should be going through the OSCE on the European side, because there are countries from both Eastern and Western Europe who are involved, and the European Union and the governments. So this is a diplomatic issue. This is not a military issue that should be in the hands of NATO.
If I
All
could just
right.
call
Oh, yeah,
attention-
go ahead, Kathy.
I just said in the chat, Bob Elmendorf, I think that the person you were referring to is Dr. Shah Mehrabi, and there's a very helpful link to something that was posted on Al Jazeera. So thank you, Martha, for posting that.
Great, thank you. I think I'll have one more question here, and then we will close out. This is a question from Maureen, who's one of the organizers of this webinar. Maureen says, is there any value in advocating for the revitalization of the gutted, grossly underfunded State Department?
Yes, I would say yes. Right now, the State Department, between the State Department itself and USAID, which is problematic from a host of reasons, but they both are important. Their total budget is about $70 billion, which is, again, compared to the military budget, it's 1/10 of the military budget, less than 1/10. So this is really, it is very important that we be able to say, let the diplomats do their work, whether that's in Ukraine or whether that's in Afghanistan. Under Trump, the State Department staff was hollowed out because so many diplomats were simply not prepared to defend those policies. So they're missing huge numbers of mid-level diplomats that have the institutional memory, who have worked on the ground in other countries for bad purposes in many cases, but not always bad people. So yes, I think that the priority of how governments function should be much more focused on diplomacy and not war. That means funding the State Department and not the Pentagon. That's where the money should come from. Cut the Pentagon budget. Some of it should be turned over to the State Department.
All right, thank you, everyone. We are going to wrap up with one more song from Terry. Before we wrap up, I see lots of comments in the chat. Yes, so we are going to be sending out this recording to everyone who registered for this webinar. We will send it out in an email within a couple of days. Also, the Grannies have been doing an amazing job working with Kathy and Phyllis, compiling lots of resources, articles, the petition, videos, a fundraiser you can contribute to help Afghanis. So there's lots of resources that we'll be compiling and sending out in that email. So don't worry about trying to copy everything down from the chat, but we will follow up with that. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we will go to Terry to close us out.
It's a song by Sarah Thompson. She wrote this about the starving Iraqi children during the sanctions there. It's called Is It for Freedom? Rulers of the nation, as you fuss and fight over who owns this or that and who has the right to design, build, sell, and store and fire all the bombs and guns to defend your holy empires. There are children, hungry children, sick and dying. There are mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers crying. They're only pawns in your plays of power and corruption. Slowly starve them, your new weapon of mass destruction. And prove to me, America, that you care. And prove to me, America, that you're aware. Who's dying for your freedom in this land? Who pays the cost for the liberties you demand? Is it for freedom or our comfort and convenience? Is it to profit for big business that we pledge our allegiance? Are we prisoners in the land of the brave and bold? Held by indifference, our hearts grown hard and cold. Children of the world, you have the right to sing and dance, run and play. Let your dreams take flight. As the innocent die, you rulers carry the blame. And if we stand idly by, we share in the shame. And oh, America, do we care? And oh, America, are we aware? Who's dying for our comfort in this land? Who pays the cost for the convenience we demand? Children of the world, you have the right to sing and dance, run and play. Let your dreams take flight. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Mabel. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Phyllis. And thank you, Mark. And have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you all.